Hank, the front desk security guard at Midland Dynamics, had a look on his face like he was about to tell me it was going to rain. He looked a little apologetic, but mostly he just looked tired, like he had spent the weekend arguing with his lawnmower. He cleared his throat, did not look me in the eye, and told me that my security badge had been deactivated. I swiped the plastic card again, hoping it was just a glitch in the reader, but the little red light stayed solid, and the metal turnstile did not budge. I stood there holding my stainless steel thermos in one hand and a brown paper bag with a turkey sandwich in the other. Around me, the usual morning rush of guys in suits and younger engineers with backpacks flowed through the gates like I was a rock in the middle of a creek. I gave Hank a dry smile and said that if the front office wanted to lock me out, they must have decided that our patents did not need protecting today. Hank did not laugh, and I did not blame him. He was just doing his job, and in this economy, you do not make jokes about people losing their livelihood. I was 48 years old, and for the last 12 years, I had been the senior licensing ops analyst for Midland Dynamics. I started back in 2014, coming straight from a career as a Navy gas turbine specialist. In the Navy, they teach you to respect the system. If you do not understand how the fuel pump affects the main reduction gear, you are just guessing when the engine stops. I brought that exact mindset to Midland Dynamics. I was not flashy, and I did not use the buzzwords that the sales guys threw around like cheap cologne. What I did was read. I read every contract, every licensing rider, and every single footnote. In 12 years, I had written the contracts that protected our 9-figure patent portfolio. My biggest achievement was Project Aegis. It was a complex web of shared development notes, software licensing triggers, and international patent rights. At its peak, Project Aegis brought in $15 million a quarter. I did not just help negotiate the deals, I built the compliance framework from scratch. During the dual joint restructuring back in 2017, when our partner, Sol Electron, tried to pull out, I drafted a specific assignment rider. It was a protective clause that made me Stephen Fletcher, the sole personal assignee of any transfer or sale of Aegis core assets. It was not assigned to Midland Dynamics, and it was not assigned to the legal department. It was assigned to me personally. I did not do it for power. I did it because I had seen too many good projects destroyed by greedy executives who tried to dump assets during a merger without understanding the technology. It was my insurance policy. The retired plant manager, Clifford Thorne, understood my value. He had been with the company since the late 80s and knew that people, not spreadsheets, kept the factory running. When I drafted the Aegis rider, Clifford signed it, and Eleanor Vance, who represented the family that founded Midland Dynamics, signed it too. Clifford filed it in the Union Archive to keep it safe from corporate restructuring. But things changed fast when Preston Riggs arrived as the new vice president of strategic operations. Preston was 35 years old, wore expensive sport coats, and had a smile that felt like a sales pitch. He talked constantly about lean optimization and asset liquidity. He started firing entire departments, outsourcing our maintenance to an app called Mopley and cutting our staff to the bone. My wife, Linda Fletcher, told me to keep my head down and let the storm pass. But I knew Preston was eyeing Project Aegis. He saw it as legacy bloat, an operational anchor that could be sold for quick cash to boost his own resume. That Monday morning, standing outside the locked gate with my dead badge, I realized the storm had finally hit. Preston had no idea that by locking me out, he had just triggered the very security system he was trying to dismantle. To understand why this mattered, you had to understand the history of our licensing agreements. Midland Dynamics was not always a corporate machine. We started as a specialized engineering shop, building high-tolerance components for medical equipment. Our patents were the result of decades of trial and error. When I arrived, the legal archives were a mess of loose papers and outdated digital files. I spent the first 3 years of my career organizing those archives, translating technical specifications into clear legal boundaries. I knew which patents were active, which ones were approaching their expiration dates, and which ones were tied to exclusive regional distribution rights. Project Aegis was the culmination of that work. It was not just a collection of documents. It was the lifeblood of our technical operations. If a competitor got access to those patents, they could duplicate our manufacturing process in a matter of weeks. The assignment writer was designed to prevent that exact scenario. It was a legal lockbox, and I was the only one with the key. Clifford Thorne had warned me that the company would eventually forget about the agreement. He told me that new executives would only see the revenue numbers, not the technical dependencies. He was right. Preston Riggs only saw a pool of cash, and he was ready to sell it to the highest bidder without checking the title. The Human Resources office was located on the third floor, past the empty cubicles where the accounting team used to sit before Preston outsourced them. Stacy Geller, a 31-year-old HR representative, was waiting for me with a cardboard box and a tight, nervous smile. The office floor was quiet, and the smell of stale coffee hung in the air. Stacy wore a gray cardigan and kept apologizing, telling me that the company was restructure-minded and my position had been eliminated. She handed me a stack of exit documents and said there was a 3-week transition consultancy clause in the agreement, just in case they needed my help. But otherwise my access was cut off. I took the box, packed my ceramic coffee mug, my desk calendar, a framed photo of Linda Fletcher and our retriever, Buster, and my old Navy brass compass, and walked out. I did not argue, and I did not make a scene. I knew that Preston Riggs had personally ordered my termination to clear the way for his big move. He wanted to sell the Project Aegis portfolio to Stonefield Capital, a venture firm that specialized in buying distressed tech assets. I knew Preston had been shopping the portfolio around for weeks, bragging to the board about a $110 million cash deal that would make the company look highly profitable. The next morning, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of black coffee and reviewed my copy of the Project Aegis agreement. Clause 14.2c was exactly as I remembered. It was written in plain English, stating that all transfers, assignments, or changes to the controlling interest of the Aegis core assets required the express written signature of the designated custodial assignee. My name was on the line, signed by Clifford Thorne and countersigned by Sol Electron. It was a binding, irrevocable personal assignment. Without my signature, any transfer of the patents was legally void ab initio, meaning it had no legal standing from the very beginning. Preston Riggs had been so focused on cutting headcount that he never bothered to read the contract. He thought I was just a clerk who filed papers, not the actual custodian of the technology. I decided to give them a week to realize their mistake. I did not call the office, and I did not send any warning letters. I just went out to my garage, worked on my old truck, and enjoyed the quiet morning with Buster. My wife, Linda, sat across from me that evening as we had a simple dinner of meatloaf and potatoes. She asked me if I was worried about the future, but I just smiled and told her that we had an insurance policy. I explained the concept of void ab initio to Linda. I told her that in the legal world, if a transaction is void from the beginning, it means it is a legal nullity. It is as if the contract was never written. Midland Dynamics could sign all the letters of intent they wanted, but without my signature on the final deed, the entire deal was nothing but paper. Linda knew how hard I had worked to protect those patents, and she trusted my judgment. She poured me another glass of iced tea and said she hoped Preston Riggs enjoyed his short celebration. On Friday, I received a short text message from Harvey Miller, the senior counsel at Midland Dynamics. Harvey was a quiet man who had survived 3 corporate mergers by keeping his head down, but he was a good lawyer who knew how to read a contract. He asked if I had seen the press release draft about the Stonefield Capital acquisition. He was worried about the compliance records, which were starting to show discrepancies. I replied with a short message, telling him to review Clause 14.2c before they executed the final letter of intent. Harvey did not reply, but I knew he would start looking through the files. Meanwhile, Preston was already celebrating. He posted a photo on his professional social media page, standing next to a whiteboard with the numbers $110 million circled in red. The caption talked about velocity, agility, and leaving legacy weight behind. He had no idea that the legacy weight he had just thrown out the door was the only thing keeping his entire deal from crashing to the ground. I sat on my porch with Linda, watched the sunset, and realized that my years of reading footnotes were about to pay off in a big way. I knew that the silence from the office would not last, and I was prepared to wait. To make sure my legal position was secure, I spent the weekend organizing my files. I had copies of every signature, every email exchange, and every draft of the original agreement. I knew that when the lawyers from Stonefield Capital started their due diligence, they would look for a clean chain of title. They would want to see that Midland Dynamics had the legal authority to transfer the patents. When they reached the assignment writer, they would find my name. They would realize that the company had tried to sell an asset they did not fully control. I knew that the legal department would search for my personnel file, but they would not find the writer there. Clifford Thorne had been smart enough to file it in the shop steward's grievance archives, where it was protected by collective bargaining laws. It was a secure hiding place, and it meant that Preston Riggs could not simply delete my record from the human resources database to make the problem go away. The contract was a physical reality, and it was waiting for them. By the middle of the following week, the operational cracks at Midland Dynamics were turning into deep chasms. When you fire the senior analyst who has spent 12 years managing the technical compliance of a 9-figure patent portfolio, you do not just lose a worker, you lose the operating manual. The new systems engineer, a young guy named Liam Brooks, whom Preston hired to replace me, did not know how to run the predictive maintenance software. On Wednesday morning, the Haas computer numerical control machine on line 3 began throwing a high-temperature alarm on its spindle bearing. Gary Lopez, the shop supervisor, came to my house on his lunch break. He looked stressed, telling me that line 3 was scheduled to run a high-volume run for our biggest medical client, and the shutdown was costing the company $40,000 an hour. Gary asked if I could log in remotely to recalibrate the sensors. I told him that my access had been cut off and that my contract explicitly prohibited me from performing any technical support outside of my official transition period, which had not been activated. I advised him to have Preston call the Haas manufacturer directly. Gary went back to the plant and Preston called the manufacturer. The customer service agent told him that a field technician could not arrive until next Tuesday, and the diagnostic visit alone would cost $4,000. Preston tried to bypass the schedule by calling the Haas regional manager, but the manager did not know Preston and refused to prioritize the request. Line 3 stayed dark for 4 days, costing Midland Dynamics over $160,000 in delayed shipments. The client, a major regional hospital network, sent a formal warning letter to our executive board. The next breakdown happened on the Vanguard precision laser cutter. The machine began producing rough cuts, ruining $95,000 worth of custom monitor housings. Preston, who did not understand that the laser tube simply needed a 20-minute calibration, approved a total tube replacement that cost $12,000 and took the machine offline for 3 days. Our shipping department was completely bottlenecked, and the sales team was fielding angry phone calls from clients who were missing critical medical components. Valerie Gomez, the vice president of operations, sent an urgent email to Preston, demanding to know why our technical response time had collapsed. Preston replied by blaming the legacy infrastructure, but he could not hide the fact that his optimized plant was failing to meet its basic delivery targets. Gary Lopez told me later that the atmosphere on the shop floor had become toxic. The workers were frustrated because they were losing their overtime pay due to the machine failures. They knew that I had always been able to resolve these issues within an hour, and they did not understand why the new management had let me go. Liam Brooks was completely overwhelmed, spending his days reading the manuals and trying to understand my custom code. He had even tried to call my personal phone, but I did not answer. I was not being petty. I was simply following the rules that Preston Riggs had established. If I was legacy weight, then they did not need my help to run their modern plant. I spent my afternoons working on my vegetable garden, enjoying the quiet and waiting for the inevitable phone call from the legal department. I knew that the physical machines would eventually force the executives to face the legal reality of what they had done. You cannot run a high-tech factory on buzzwords, and the mechanical steel of the CNC machines did not care about Preston's strategic vision. As the days went on, the backup in the shipping bay grew worse. The warehouse floor was stacked high with unfinished components, and the logistics manager was running out of space. He had to rent 3 refrigerated trailers to store the sensitive medical parts that could not be shipped without compliance certification. The cost of those rentals was $500 a day, another expense that Preston had not included in his optimization budget. The supervisors were arguing in the hallways, and the engineers were spending their nights trying to debug the custom scripts that I had written to coordinate the assembly line. They did not understand that the scripts were tied to specific hardware addresses that changed every time the machines were rebooted. It was a complex system that required daily monitoring, and without my oversight, it was slowly grinding to a halt. Preston Riggs was learning that the back-office tasks he had dismissed as administrative red tape were the very things that kept the gears turning. Gary Lopez sat on my porch during another visit, drinking a cold glass of tea. He told me that Liam had tried to bypass the PLC systems completely, which almost burned out the main electrical bus. The plant floor was in a panic because their production targets were tied to their quarterly performance bonuses, and now they were looking at a complete shutdown. He said the guys were talking about starting a work-to-rule protest if the machinery was not fixed soon. I listened to him, but my face remained neutral. I told Gary that I had spent years documenting these systems, but the management had decided that my documentation was process overhead. I had spent countless nights recalibrating those spindles after hours, often skipping dinner with Linda to make sure that the morning shift could start without a delay. Now they were paying the price for their shortcuts, and the operational collapse was entirely their own doing. While the plant floor was struggling with equipment failures, the real crisis was developing in the legal department. The Aegis Compliance Database, which tracked our quality control records for regulatory audits, required a manual validation every 30 days. If the validation was not completed, the software was programmed to flag the entire system as non-compliant, which would legally halt all shipments of our medical products. I had set up this safety feature to ensure that our quality standards never slipped. On Monday morning, the system flashed a red warning, indicating that the validation window was closing in 48 hours. Stacy Geller sent an urgent support ticket to Preston, but he let it sit on his desk, thinking it was just a routine IT issue. He did not understand that a compliance failure would trigger an immediate audit from the regulatory inspectors, which would shut down the entire facility. At the same time, the lawyers for Stonefield Capital were performing their due diligence. They had signed the letter of intent for the $110 million acquisition, but their senior counsel, Grant Fowler, noticed something unusual in the patent records. He saw my name listed as the personal assignee on the core Aegis documents. On Wednesday at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Grant Fowler contacted me on my personal email. He asked if we could have a brief, off-the-record conversation about the patent structure. We met at a quiet diner near my house, a place called the Blue Star Diner, with worn vinyl booths and strong coffee. Grant was a professional who did not waste time. He showed me the documents and asked if I was aware of the assignment writer. I pulled my copy of the agreement from my bag and laid it on the table. I explained that under Clause 14.2c, the patent transfer was invalid without my signature. I told him that Midland Dynamics did not own the transfer rights. They only held a non-exclusive license. If they attempted to sell the assets without my approval, the transaction would be void ab initio, exposing Stonefield Capital to immediate litigation from our partners in Seoul. I explained that the joint venture agreement was structured this way to prevent either partner from selling the technology to a competitor. The assignment rider was a protective measure that had been approved by the board years ago, during a time when Midland Dynamics valued technical stability over short-term financial gains. Grant read the agreement twice, his face growing pale. He realized that Preston Riggs had tried to sell a product he did not legally control, using a contract that was completely invalid. He thanked me, took his notes, and left. I went home, sat on the porch with Linda, and watched Buster chase leaves in the yard. I knew that the next meeting would not be held in a quiet diner, and I was ready for the call. The legal framework of our licensing agreements was solid, and I knew that no amount of corporate posturing could change the words written on the paper. Preston Riggs had thought he could ignore the details, but he was about to learn that the details were the only thing that mattered. He had built his entire career on selling empty promises, but he was about to hit a solid wall of contract law that he could not charm his way through. I knew that Grant Fowler would go straight to his partners with the news. He was too good of a lawyer to let his client buy a lawsuit. The partners at Stonefield Capital would realize that if they proceeded with the deal, they would be investing in a void asset. They would be exposed to claims of patent infringement and tortious interference from Sol Electron. The legal consequences would be devastating, and it would destroy their reputation in the venture capital community. I knew that they would demand a meeting with the Midland Dynamics board to address the issue. I also knew that Preston Riggs would try to spin the situation, claiming that he could easily resolve the problem by offering me a small payout. He did not understand that I was not interested in his money. I wanted to protect the work I had spent 12 years building, and I wanted to make sure that the company respected the agreements they had signed. The database was structured on a SQL server, running a series of custom validation queries that checked the manufacturing logs against the quality control database. If there was a discrepancy of even a fraction of a millimeter in the CNC machine cuts, the system would flag the batch for review. The 30-day validation window was a critical checkpoint. It was designed to ensure that if a machine began to drift out of calibration, the products would be stopped before they left the warehouse. When the red alert began to flash on the monitor in the server room, Liam Brooks did not know what it meant. He thought it was just a warning about database storage space, so he tried to delete the archive logs to clear the alert. But my security script blocked his access, locking the database completely. The server room was in a state of panic, with the IT team trying to restore the database from backups, but the backups were also locked by the encryption key that only I possessed. The final meeting was held in the executive conference room on the top floor of Midland Dynamics. Preston Riggs was in his element, standing at the head of the table in a $1,200 sport coat, gesturing to a PowerPoint slide that showed the transaction structure. He was talking about synergy and the $110 million cash injection that would secure the company's future. Diana Cross, the lead counsel for Stonefield Capital, sat across from him, her folder closed. I sat in the back row, wearing my old work jacket, completely ignored by Preston until the door closed. Diana stood up and asked Preston to clarify the status of the Aegis assignment. Preston smiled and said that the assignment was just old boilerplate, a legal fiction created by a former employee who had been let go 3 months ago. He looked at the buyers and said that I was just a footnote in the company's history. Diana Cross did not smile. She pulled out the highlighted copy of Clause 14.2c and slid it across the table. She told Preston that the clause was active, binding, and required my signature. She added that without my consent, the entire acquisition was void ab initio. Preston's smile froze. He turned to me, his voice rising as he told me to be reasonable and sign the paper. He tried to offer me a standard consultant fee, but I did not respond. I stood up, walked to the table, and looked him in the eye. I told him that I did not approve the sale and that my decision was final. The room went completely silent. Diana Cross closed her binder, stood up, and walked out of the room, followed by the entire Stonefield Capital team. The deal was dead. Within 12 hours, Preston Riggs was forced to resign for gross negligence and breach of fiduciary duty. The general counsel resigned the next morning. The board members were in a panic, realizing that their golden boy had almost cost them a massive lawsuit. A week later, Grant Fowler called me with an offer. Stonefield Capital wanted to hire me as their principal licensing consultant to manage the Aegis portfolio. The offer included a monthly retainer that was 4 times my old salary, plus company options and full authority over the patent assignments. I accepted the offer and signed the contract that afternoon. Before I closed my old laptop, I drafted a final email to Preston's deactivated account. I wrote that I was still just a footnote, but I was the footnote that owned the contract. I hit send, shut the computer, and went outside to join Linda and Buster. I had protected the work, secured my family's future, and proved that the man who reads the contract is the one who holds the key. The new path was clear, and I was ready to walk it with the confidence of a man who knew he had done the job right. The victory was not loud, but it was absolute. I had spent 12 years working in the background, making sure that every detail was correct. I had survived the corporate buzzwords, the optimization consultants, and the arrogant executives who thought they could run a high-tech company on spreadsheets alone. In the end, the system worked exactly as it was designed. The contract I had written during a late-night restructuring session in 2017 was the very thing that saved my career. It was a simple reminder that the details matter. It was a lesson that Preston Riggs learned the hard way, and it was a lesson that I would continue to apply in my new role with Stonefield Capital. I knew that there would be new challenges, new contracts to read, and new agreements to negotiate, but I was ready for them. I had the experience. I had the support of my family, and I had the peace of mind that comes from knowing you did not compromise your principles for a corporate paycheck. The room was hot, the air conditioning struggling to keep up with the midday heat. The mahogany table was covered in folders, water bottles, and legal pads. Preston Riggs stood at the end of the room, his voice loud as he pointed to the projection screen. He was talking about the transaction, using words like synergy, liquidity, and operational excellence. He had a slide that showed a timeline of the acquisition, with the final closing date marked in bold red letters. He looked at the Stonefield Capital team, expecting them to nod in agreement, but they sat in silence, their faces expressionless. Diana Cross was looking down at her binder, while Grant Fowler was watching Preston with a look that was almost pitying. I sat in the corner, holding my thermos, waiting for the moment when the slides would stop and the legal reality would take over. Preston's face went from pale to a deep red, the veins in his neck bulging as he glared at me. He slammed his folder on the table, demanding that I sign the paper immediately. He said that I was destroying the company's future and that they would sue me for damages if the deal fell through. I looked at him, then at the board members, and finally at Diana Cross. I told him that I did not care about his money or his threats. The contract was clear, and my signature was the only thing that could authorize the transfer.